storage is an integral part. We need that at scale to support the renewable energy. There are two targets. One is called the renewable purchase obligations, RPOs, and a similar energy storage obligation.
Indians are starting to warm up to these technologies, but yeah, it's a slow process.
It depends on how you've designed it, how you've built it, and how comfortable you are in making it follow the load, right?
A few years, if not a few decades, to move away from what is the paradigm today. So we have coal which supplies just over 70% of our electricity today.
What really then matters now is where you put the money.
Welcome to the Better India's podcast series, Reimagining Energy. I'm your host, Christelle D'Souza. According to a March 2025 report published by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, how can India meet its rising power demand? Pathways to 2030. India needs to scale up to 600 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030 to meet its growing electricity demands reliably and affordably. To facilitate this, India needs robust energy storage systems in place. In this episode, we are exploring the vital role that these energy storage systems will play in making India's transformation from fossil fuel dependency to renewable energy both sustainable and reliable. To talk about this critical topic, we've got two seasoned researchers. We've got Karthik Ganesan, who is Fellow and Director Strategic Partnerships at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Karthik's expertise lies in energy and environment, focusing on India's electricity systems. We've also got Ashwin Gambhir, who is fellow at Prayas Energy Group. And Ashwin's expertise lies in coordinating policy regulatory research in renewable energy. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you for being on the podcast. Give us a 101 on energy storage systems in India.
So I guess we all know energy storage because we use it. We use batteries at home because wherever electricity is needed and it's not plugged in, we need batteries. In a similar way, the electricity grid that we all rely on, when there is no generation source, which is likely the case in the future, where, for instance, solar is not there and wind is not blowing, there will have to be some supply, and as a result, we will require a stored form of energy to be pumped back into the grid. And where does that store electricity from? Of course, electricity that's generated from solar and wind goes into the battery and then it comes back out. Now, the reason why we don't have too much batteries today is because whatever solar and wind are being generated are being fed directly into the grid and is being consumed then and there. But what we do find is, in fact, some incidents played out even in the last few weeks was that at times when the generation of solar is too high, there's not enough demand, right? It could be a situation like this May, for instance, when it was not as hot as we expected, so people didn't consume as much electricity, or entities did not. So you couldn't turn down your thermal power plants because solar was generating a lot, but thermal power plants couldn't go down, and the price of electricity on the exchange was literally zero and sometimes even negative, which meant that you were not getting value for electricity that you were generating. Now, here is where batteries become very useful, which is one, they can absorb any additional electricity that you're generating, which is not being consumed. Technically, it could be electricity being generated from even a coal fired power plant. So it just balances the demand and the supply by creating an artificial demand. And the good part is it stores, and then you can put electricity back into the grid when you need it, which could be in the night time. For instance, in India today, during the night time, you only have electricity being supplied from coal for the most part. There's a bit of hydro, of course, in particular seasons, and then there'll be nuclear and others, but it's mostly coal at the night time, right? So when you go back home at 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., there's no sun, there's no wind for the most part of the year, it's mostly coal. Now, here is when, if you stored electricity from a battery, it would actually put electricity back in, and that would then help you with, cleaning the electricity system overall. It would require, of course, a massive scale up of renewable energy in the first place so that you can generate more electricity during the day, put it into the battery, and then you supply it later on in the evening. So that's the reason why we need it. It was, of course, a holy grail because we just didn't have the materials for it. Now, and there was, of course, we had a Nobel Prize being given to John Goodenough and others earlier in this century, which is for the discovery of materials that would help store energy, and that's the lithium-ion battery. And we are scaling that up with the hope that eventually, when we have a largely renewable energy based grid, batteries will play a much larger role in the way we are supplying. This is purely from an energy perspective. We'll probably speak about what else batteries can do as we progress along, Christelle.
Absolutely. And I think the way this solution is so cyclic is beautiful, right? I want to draw upon a point that you spoke about. You spoke about coal. And Ashwin, I want to bring you in here because there was an article by Prayas, Power Perspectives, which spoke about coal. It positioned coal as critical to India's fast-paced power sector. Now, there's a dichotomy because on the one hand, we have policy makers who they have the intention that India shifts away from fossil fuel dependency. And then on the other hand, there's coal being positioned as critical. Tell me why. And after the why, maybe, Karthik could elaborate on retrofitting coal capacity and the potential.
Yeah, so one has to understand India is a very, very large electricity system, and any transition is not an overnight thing. It's going to take a few years, if not a few decades, to move away from what is the paradigm today. So we have coal which supplies over 70% of our electricity today, and there is a certain rate at which we can build renewables. They have become really cheap. So it is in our economic interest to build a lot of renewables. There are a lot of social and environmental benefits of renewable energy, but there's a certain pace at which the renewables build out can happen. And to that extent, we are building a lot of renewables, wind and solar in particular. But coal is there to stay for this decade, for the next decade as well, because demand is growing a lot as urbanization is increasing, incomes are increasing, manufacturing is increasing, electricity demand is increasing at 5 to 6%, and shortages is just not an option for an economy. Electricity is so fundamental to our modern economy. We just can't survive without it. So on the one hand, you have growing demand, and you just don't want shortages. So coal will remain a bedrock of the electricity sector in this decade, in the coming decade. But from 72%, most of the studies, official studies, are saying something like 50 to 55% very quickly, just by the end of this decade. So the relative share of coal is definitely reducing, though in absolute terms, it's not about to go away anytime soon. And one shouldn't think of coal or renewables as either or. The system needs all kinds of resources to maintain reliability, to have the diversity of different resources and their strengths and benefits to have a reliable electricity system. Uh, in terms of new coal projects, because coal projects can last for 30 to 40 years, that is where really policymakers, regulators, and planners need to critically look and assess the need for it, because costs have been going up, and while the cost of renewables have been coming down. So there are the fundamentals, the role of the coal sector is changing. What was considered a stable baseline operation is changing, because you have very, very cheap renewables in the daytime, especially solar. So the economics, the financial risks behind coal are changing, and that needs to be thought out when planning in the really long term.
Right. And
Yeah,
Karthik, come in on retrofitting.
and as Ashwin was saying, right, while we will have this coal, whether it's the existing fleet and possibly some amount of new additions, what is important to see is that that's what is giving you energy when the rest of the system is not able to. Right? We talked about solar and wind being seasonal slash diurnal, um, which also begs the question: then what happens to an asset which still has a lot of productive use to it? So, for instance, the coal-based fleet, whether it's the current one or new ones, they do have the ability to sort of follow the load in some way. There are technical restrictions, but it can go up and down. It depends on how you've designed it, how you've built it, and how comfortable you are in making it follow the load, right? There are challenges in the way operators are not able to do that with, let's say, very old plants. With newer ones, they're able to. In fact, the French actually even managed to do that with nuclear power plants.
Mm.
So, in that sense, the role will be for us to figure out how do you retrofit these plants so that they can actually follow the load in a better way. So we talked about earlier about the incidences of plants not being able to ramp down enough to accommodate all the renewables coming in. As a result, prices were negative. What you could have instead had was, if many of these plants or more of these plants had the retrofitting where you could, let's say, turn down the burner a little bit, right, reduce the rate at which there was burning coal, reducing the output, you could essentially have accommodated more renewable energy and as a result not consume that coal. There are implications for the life of the asset, which is the main concern, right? Think of it like this, right? So you're basically, making it go up and down. It induces stresses in the device, in the boiler and the tubes, which means that the person who owns that asset is a lot less comfortable using it in that way, because a coal plant was meant to be used as you start it and then you operate it, right? You don't move it up and down. So that's really the comfort that we need to get, which is the financial costs of effectively operating in that manner, the technical cost of maybe watching out constantly as to whether the systems are still safe, whether there are any challenges to the integrity of the system, right? And whether it will last, for instance, the 35, 40 years that you designed it for. Once you factored all that in, that's really what will then drive how the coal fired system then integrates with this increasing renewable energy system. And what I think new studies are basically saying is that the more we make plants flexible, the more they can be useful for the long run, and also then enable this transition. Because the less the coal plants are flexible, then the less the system is able to think of how am I ever going to sort of move away from them. Because if they will continue to generate at this pace, I can't integrate more renewable energy additionally. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, what I'm gauging from your points is that the magic lies in the balance,
Hmm.
right? And also, Ashwin said something, it's not either or. You kind of have to, both have to go hand in hand. Ashwin, coming to you, I want to talk about the positives. So, let's talk about the declining cost of battery storage systems. So, in the last 2 years, if we look at the tariffs that have been applied on standalone battery storage systems, it's actually declined by 65% without subsidy, I want to add. And so, can you elaborate on how international partnerships, technology transfer can actually play a role in India's transition away from fossil fuel dependency?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And that is sort of the fundamental enabler. I was just thinking a couple of decades ago, energy storage at this scale was not even thought about with planners, with the electricity system. The fundamentals economics of the electricity system was you cannot store energy, so you have to balance the grid at every second, and supply demand have to be balanced. So but now we are looking at really cheap energy storage at scale. And primarily there are two technologies right now in the play. One is battery energy systems, lithium ion in particular, and pumped hydro systems. We'll come to that later. But the one that you referred to, the 65% price drop, that is to do with the lithium ion batteries. And there was one of the studies we had done in 4 or 5 years ago, and everyone's projecting prices, and prices have fallen much faster than even all the analysts were have been projecting. And especially in the last year, there's been a much larger drop. So essentially, China is at the forefront of manufacturing a lot of these new and clean energy technologies. So the fundamental is the electric cell, the lithium ion cell, and prices have really gone down. A lot of states have been doing tendering on standalone battery systems, on battery systems co-located with renewable energy systems, and prices have crashed. So solar plus storage, for a 4-hour system, the latest price was around 3.5 rupees a kilowatt hour. That is quite low. And in terms of standalone storage, somewhere right now it's around 30 to 40 lakhs a megawatt a month. I know this number may not make much sense, but prices really they were much higher a couple of years ago. So a lot of scale, intense competition in India with procurement by many states. There's also a mandate on energy storage obligations on these procuring discoms, that is also playing a role. And the price drop internationally has really enabled distribution companies and consumers to procure energy storage at this scale.
I mean, think of it this way, right? What the that fixed cost that Ashwin spoke about, 30 lakhs per megawatt per month. It's basically like saying it's like having a coal-fired power plant. The fixed cost. So there are two parts to a cost of a storage plant, right? There's a fixed cost, and then of course there's the energy you put in and then you take out. So similarly, if you think of it as a coal-fired power plant, the fixed cost of just putting the plant, and if you amortized it, actually storage systems today are cheaper than coal-fired power plants on a fixed cost basis in terms of the infrastructure that you put in, so that you can get energy out of it. So what really it comes down to is this: if you're able to put in energy and take it out at a cost lower than the variable cost of thermal power generation, which is really the additional adder, right? Then storage systems have won. Now, the main challenge though is that can we get more and more hours of storage out of them, right? So it's not like you have 8 hours or 9 hours of solar, and the remaining 16 hours you're going to have 16 hours worth of storage. It doesn't quite work like that because there are other systems that you're able to rely on. There's hydro, there's wind at other times during the day. So, but really, that's that thing that we need to understand, right? That there is an inflection point where that cost of generating electricity, and that's really what we need to look at from a regulation perspective and the market perspective. How do you bring those things into parity in the interest of, I think, environmental, reducing environmental degradation associated with current sources of energy that we use.
And just to build on that also, the big difference between conventional energy sources and the newer ones like wind and solar and storage is they're all upfront fixed costs. So once you build a plant, you have a very assured certainty about the price. So if you build a solar plant, let's say you're getting energy at 2 rupees a kilowatt hour, and you build a storage plant, so for the next 20 years you can be assured of the price not changing. But with coal and some other fuel dependent sources, you're quite uncertain about what the price of coal would be in the future. So there's that added financial certainty about having assurance over the price. And there are these short term energy markets in India, power exchanges, where you can buy power for the next day, for the next week. And just last the month before, we had several instances during the daytime when power prices were near zero. So that's a structural phenomena that is emerging. When you have more and more solar coming at the same time every day and demand not increasing as much, it is quite likely that daytime prices will be suppressed and keep going down. So storage really needs that arbitrage, the difference between when they can charge the battery or the pumped hydro storage when prices are really low, and they can be much lower even than solar. So imagine you're getting an assured price of 1 rupee or even lower than that, and then you can sell it back on the market or at the times in the evening or in the night time when there's a stress on the grid, the demand is really high, and people are willing to pay for that electricity. So that phenomena is really emerging in India now.
I think that's interesting. It's an interesting take for sure because when we think about green energy, it's solar that comes to our minds. And these topics usually deny an easy interpretation, but y'all are actually dissecting it, breaking it down into very simple concepts. So thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of people will recognize the potential in this. Ashwin, I'm going to have you make good on your promise on the pumped hydro energy storage. Could you elaborate on it?
Yeah, one of my colleagues recently wrote an article. He was looking quite a lot at all these permissions that are needed for pumped hydro storage systems. So there's a lot happening. And this is not a new technology per se. We have had 3 or 4 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage operating in the country, but it has been at that stage for a very long time. But very recently, given the increase in the variable and intermittent solar and wind energy in the electricity mix in the country, and the really high targets in the coming decade, the need for energy storage has been established. The central planners and the Central Electricity Authority has estimated around 400, just over 400 gigawatt hours of energy storage, which will be needed by 2032, and around 40% of that is expected to come through pumped storage. So one of the given that this is a long construction period, it's like a hydropower plant, uh, uh, but with sort of a daily storage. So you pump electricity up to the higher reservoir when prices are really low, and you let the water flow back to the turbine and generate electricity when you need the power. uh, so you need environmental clearances for that. The colleague was tracking how many plants have gotten these environmental clearances, at what stage they are, and the numbers are quite high. So over nearly 150 gigawatts, that's nearly 5 or 6 times what is needed, are in the pipeline of trying to get the environmental clearance. So the step before the environmental clearance is you get a terms of reference to study, to make a environmental impact assessment report, and then you might get an environmental clearance depending on the site location. so on and so forth. But many plants have gotten their environmental clearances. Nearly 100 gigawatt hours has been tendered, and nearly 50 gigawatts is under construction right now. So pump storage will definitely pick up in the country. Uh, Pump storage has a different advantage over battery systems, that they can give longer hours of duration. So, typically between 6 to 8 hours per day. So you can pump up the energy during the solar time, and then generate electricity over 6 to 8 hours to balance out the systems. Uh, the other thing with pump storage, though, is the gestation time. You can build battery systems within a year and a half, but pump storage typically takes 2.5 years to just get the environmental clearance, and then another 5 to 6 years to build it. So it has a place in the electricity sector, definitely. But depending on what the need is, do you want to overcome a shortage or an imbalance in the grid in a couple of years, then pumped hydro won't do you that good, because you're just not going to get it. But over a medium to long term thing, it is a vital part of the energy mix in India. And we've had several competitive bidding tenders by some states as well, and the prices are quite comparable to lithium ion batteries. But again, it's changing every few months, because the sector is very dynamic. There's lots of new technologies, and scale of manufacturing is going up. So it's still an open question in the long run, who will win out, or will both the technologies coexist for different applications. But pump storage is really definitely picking up in the Indian sector.
What I'm gaining from your answer is that there is tremendous amount of research that goes into coming up with, these technologies. And so I want to go to Karthik now. Tell us about innovations and research. Let's
Mm,
start with the research part of it, especially when it comes to policy interventions, when it comes to regulations.
yeah.
What's happening?
So we're going back to where we started all of this, right? So we are a fossil fuel heavy system, much like how the rest of the world is and was, and regulating that. And India electricity is regulated sector means that you have to ensure that when people put in money, they are able to make the money out of it, and then the way you then pass that electricity, that price on to the consumers, it also then factors in the various things that get added. When it comes to these new systems, as Ashwin was saying, right, you're looking at things where the costs are upfront, higher, and you need to be very clear that when you're making this decision to invest, you have the ability to recoup the money as well. So there is a big role for the regulator to play in terms of assessing whether some of these tariffs that are coming through, uh, how how likely are these that these will be in the advantages to the consumer because the new technologies. So really, I think what is needed today from a research and the ecosystem development perspective is, I think we need to bring together a lot of the people who operate distribution company, finances, and even their physical operations to come together and say, this is what the future will hold for us. That conversation is probably not happening, and as a result, what Ashwin spoke about earlier, which is we have large public sector entities that are investing thousands of crore in bringing conventional energy systems on board without fully doing a due diligence of what alternative energy systems mean. And even though they may be more expensive, everybody's more comfortable because you know what you get. And ultimately, it's that comfort that's driving the progression of the sector. And that's what we need to give comfort, which is where early movers are great, but we need to see how to, and I think the good part is that the government has come up with subsidies that will ensure that these early movers aren't, are de-risked because the government is putting in up to 30% of the capital associated with these projects. So that I think is the good part in the regulatory ecosystem.
Yeah,
Ashwin,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I couldn't agree more. There is this is a in the long spectrum of things. This is quite a new technology. So and system operators are have to ensure reliability. So there is a healthy skepticism. How will these systems perform actually in practice? So you're getting some price, but there's still a delay, as Karthik was saying. So the more comfort we get into to
Mm.
operating the systems, being getting them into part of the electricity system as a routine asset in the electricity system, the faster we'll uptake. Because all the modeling studies that we've been doing, Karthik has been doing, and others have been doing as well, it is very clear that renewables are very, very cheap. People have gotten comfortable with that. But you can only increase the share of renewables if you have cheap storage. But that is also there now. So if purely from our self interest, from our economic self interest, if you do modeling without any climate constraints and carbon prices, it still turns out that a renewables heavy system with energy storage is economically better for the country, and it's better for the consumers because the prices will come down. So that paradigm is slowly coming into the planners and policymakers way of analyzing the sector. Because as Karthik was saying, it is, I can see the other side. If I was a buyer, and the prices are crashing, as you said, in 2 years, if it's 65%, will I look foolish signing a contract today and then year from now prices are lower? So one can understand that. But from a national policy perspective, everyone can't wait all the time, and government of India has a viability gap funding. They've just recently, a week ago, increased the scale for 30 gigawatt hours. They're giving up to 18 lakhs a megawatt hour as a viability gap support. So the early movers are up for the this these subsidies are for up for grabs. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting take because when we talk about adoption of these systems, I think the numbers also concede that Indians are starting to warm up to these technologies, but yeah, it's a slow process. And that brings me to my next question. Feel free to weigh in about technologies. We've spoken about research. Let's talk about the practical approaches. When we talk about technologies in terms of LFP chemistry, we talk about solid state batteries, there's synthetic versus natural graphite. What's happening? How positive are we?
Yeah. So, as we said, right, this technology of lithium ion based storage, while the genesis is probably goes back to the 1980s when the technology was developed, it's a tough material to manage. Right, lithium is can get oxidized very easily. It's highly flammable, which is why it has to be handled very carefully. And even today, this concept of what's called the thermal runaway incident, right, where if it starts getting heated, you've seen so many accidents happening in EV store showrooms, right, where while it's charging, suddenly there is this excessive heating that happens, which then goes into this runaway as it calls, right, and then everything is on fire. So we want to avoid those incidences, especially in grid connected ones, because those are, it's not just one or two vehicles, you're looking at hundreds of crore of investment gone up in smoke. So which means that we have to look at how do you make this technology safer, because Indian conditions are not the same as conditions elsewhere. We already are realizing that when operating at higher ambient temperatures, the efficiency of some of these systems can be lower. There's no ambient cooling effect that's happening, right? The major thing to remember here is that we are looking at a system which is lithium ion heavy. Alternatives within lithium ion, for instance, when it started out, we had focus more on density of energy, because effectively the more energy that you can pack in, the better it is for for everybody who's doing it, because smaller space, you can extract more out of it. And of course, EVs were driving a lot of the the development of batteries. And what we found is that China, as a result of, I guess entrepreneurship is one thing, but also that risk capital, has gone ahead and made sure that lithium iron phosphate batteries, LFP as we call it, right, have got a second wind, so to say. Everybody realized that they were quite good to operate with, but its performance is not as great from an EV perspective. But then in the last 6 or 7 years, it's had a resurgence where it's really overtaken earlier chemistries, right? On whether it's lithium nickel manganese, or any one of the ones that are used cobalt in its formulations. We all talked of how cobalt is mined in the DRC pretty much, and how the concentration of the resource and the way it was extracted was causing problems. There was, of course, human rights violations that were happening. So now we can set aside all of those concerns and say LFP chemistries are now competitive on multiple different fronts. Cost, of course, but also when it comes to the way they perform. And all of that happened because the Chinese ended up putting together the resources to build a much better ecosystem for LFP to come together and scale. Similarly, for instance, anode material, given that the electrolyte is still liquid and not a solid one, has to be something that again performs well. When we go to solid state electrolytes, solid state batteries, there you can have lithium metal as electrolyte as an anode. This would be useful as well, because the anode is a very important part of the battery as well, right? And solid state batteries, that's the holy grail. How can I do away with the electrolyte, which is the flammable part, and come up with something which is ceramic based, which will then ensure that the safety goes up an order of magnitude. People are working on that. And then you've got technologies like, for instance, sodium ion batteries. In fact, I think Reliance bought over a company, Faraday On, some years ago, and I think ISRO is also actively looking at investing in, because one, from a material perspective, sodium is much more prevalent, and we have access to it, sea salt, right? Sodium chloride, right? We don't have to look at China or Chile or anywhere else for the supply of lithium. That said, sodium ion batteries, I think India realizes that that's where we need to put a little bit more resources, and having a giant like Reliance sort of invest in it in a company and then take that technology forward is a good sign. On the remaining part of the system, I think time will tell how long before we get to solid state batteries, and becoming a reality. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm gaining from what you all said is it's like walking a tightrope, right?
Mm.
So you
Mm.
kind of need to find the balance. Karthik, I want to come back
Mm.
to your
Mm.
cab driver.
Mm.
So I love that story because I feel it's such an anecdotal illustration of how complex topics are, the effects of these complex topics are kind of seeping into people's lives. And I think it also calls into premise the fact that we need to speed things up. And so my next question, and maybe both of you could share insights, we'll start with Karthik, is we know faster deployment is essential. What are the policies, what are the schemes that the union government, state governments are putting into practice to see that this happens?
I think there is definitely a commitment that you've made at an international level that then demonstrates to everybody, especially overseas investors, that India is serious about scaling up renewable energy, and with it storage systems, etc. So that is one part of the job done, right? It's well begun. What really then matters now is where you put the money. Now, that's where, as a first step, it is important for government of India and the states to do an assessment of, in the long run. When I say long, we're looking at 15 to 20 years, right? What is the way in which technologies will pan out in terms of the cost of tech, and what does it mean for the plans that I put in place today? So the CEA, the Central Electricity Authority, has already asked for states to do what's called resource adequacy plans, which tells entities, based on the way costs are panning out, how should you be sort of building out your generation base, renewable energy included, and thermal coal based power included, so that your system is reliable and you don't have outages. This assessment could be made robust, wherein the assumptions around price declines and in terms of factoring in the kinds of nuances that will be there in the system are done better in the modeling exercises. Because with every passing day, we hear that the requirement of coal-based technology is going up. We find yet
Mhm.
another. It started at 30 gigawatt additional of coal. It became 80, and then now it's probably at 120. So clear direction that this is where we are headed, and not uh, rethinking the way our expansion will happen of different capacity. I think is the possibly the most important thing that government of India can do. Ashwin, maybe you want to weigh in on what else.
No, no. I think the what Karthik started off with, the international commitment and the national commitment, that 50% of capacity from non-fossil fuels, and even a stronger commitment internally, that nearly 45% in energy terms by 2030. So in the short term, everyone's aligned that we have to hit that target. There's a longer term target, 2070 net zero, but maybe for 2035, where the resource adequacy studies are being done, or till 2040. uh, you know we are definitely, given the price signals, it is only going to increase. The share of renewables and energy storage will definitely increase. And I think the government of India has really pushed states to procure more and more. So there are two targets. One is called the renewable purchase obligations, RPOs, and a similar energy storage obligation. So right now it's set at around 43% by 2030. That 43% of your electricity, in energy terms, should come from renewables. So states have been a little reluctant in following up on those targets and actually meeting them on the ground for a variety of reasons. And government of India has really been pushing them. There have been recent changes in the Energy Conservation Act to make them more sort of, stringent and mandatory in the legal nature. And on the other side, it's not just setting targets and guidance, but it's also giving subsidies in the form of VGF, the viability gap support for capex for setting up these energy storage systems, also for manufacturing, the production linked incentives for advanced chemistry cells, so manufacturing battery systems in India as well. So there has been a lot of support guidance from the government of India. It's now really the execution and scale and the procurement happens at the state level, and that is where the distribution companies, the electricity distribution companies, their finances are not in great shape. A lot of states have been really procuring a lot of renewable energy. It is picking up, but a lot more can be done in terms of uh, can you scale up or speed up procurement in terms of building transmission faster and building renewable energy parks where these solar plants can be built faster, so that that uptake happens. Because sort of the national target is around 50 gigawatts a year you need to build, but we are last year we did around 30. This year we are close to, possibly we'll do 35 or a little more, but we need to do much more.
Right. So clear direction and the absolute emphasis on subsidies is what I'm getting. There's a report, in fact, by CEEW, which
Yeah.
says that so India is trying to amp up its what the energy that it's meeting from non-fossil fuel capacities, right? And the report says that India's installed solar capacity stands at 66.7 gigawatts as of FY23.
Hmm.
The waste that's generated because of that is 100 kilotons.
Yep.
And if we want to meet our 2030 goal, the waste that's going to be generated is 340 kilotons. Now, that's a hefty figure. As in the case of every story, there's two sides of the coin, positives and negatives. Let's
Yeah.
talk about environmental
Yeah.
concerns.
This has been, the I guess the bogeyman for nuclear, for nuclear as well as of course for solar now, because everybody sees when you're adopting something new, it's good. It's good that we're today suddenly waking up and saying before we take a step in a direction, let's see what the downsides are of going down that road. But it shouldn't sort of take our eye off what does it mean for overall sustainability, right? If you look at it in the bigger scheme of things, 300 kilotons is a fraction of the amount of waste that's generated, for instance,
Hmm.
from the use of conventional sources.
Yeah, just to come, the number is so eerily, strange. We use around a billion tons of coal, and if you say
30% of it.
35% is ash, you have 340 million tons. That's three orders of magnitude higher that you're generating every year today,
Already,
Yeah.
right?
and that contains all kinds of
All
noxious
kinds of
things.
things as well. So while there is a use case for that, this is not to say, I mean, this is not going into whataboutery about what about coal. We're not trying to deflect the argument, but yeah, I'm glad we're thinking about it. But we should be thinking about it holistically, where the same standard that's being applied to emerging technologies is also being applied to existing technologies. Nuclear has had it from the get go. Because you just can't dispose it anywhere because it poses immense hazard.
Right.
The reality is that waste that comes out of coal based power plants, which is the ash, at least the bottom ash, has to be deposited, done away in dikes, which is poisoning drinking water in multiple parts of the country. So let's be very clear that that also has an impact. Now, that said, these volumes, while large, uh, the challenge is this: for somebody to set up a recycling shop that will ensure that this recycling or waste management facility means that this waste has to materialize somehow, right? The thing is, you put in money today and you're going to wait for this waste to show up before you can start using this factory to
Mhm.
strip apart the solar panel into different components and then get value out of it. Means you're going to wait for a few years. Now, that is where the challenge is, that you can't, every one of these new systems, there has to be a first mover, what we went back to. Somebody has to demonstrate that I'm willing to put down the capital, showcase that when the waste stream builds up, I can reliably do this. I have a market for some of the products that will come out. So the easy ones, for instance, are the copper, the aluminum that is actually integral to the panels. The glass, not really much value, but you can recycle it in some way. There are, of course, other valuable materials. Silver, for instance, is also there in significant quantities, but then you need more volumes for it to come together, and then demonstrate that that goes back. But most importantly, this requires a regulatory lead, meaning that compliance has to drive the way waste management happens. If you wait for the market to showcase that there is a value and hence I will recycle, it will take the market that much time because the market responds with a lag.
Yeah.
when it sees that there is a value for some of this stuff. So we may not yet be there, but then if we wait for the market, then we've basically already let not just 300,000 tons, it may become a million tons. And these have complex chemicals, there's no denying that. And how that gets managed is another challenge. And one of the reasons why today, for instance, there's still an active program that looks at, for instance, lead, is because lead, in the way it's actually recycled, for the most part, is actually in the informal sector. Only in the last 10 years have we seen some clawback of the formal sector, because lead is easily recycled in the informal sector, but it is very, very harmful to the environment and the people who operate it. So, do we want to ensure that there is a formal mechanism in place, and it has to be regulation in lead, where there has to be compliance that have to be checked to ensure that whether it's post consumer, developers, and people who've installed it, or whether it's pre consumer, the guys who actually manufacture, are meeting their requirements in terms of, okay, if you've generated 100 tons of waste, are you showing me that 100 tons has been recycled through credits? Because then that'll get used up through the the person who's got the EPR credits, etc., right? So that's where I feel this would go. And same applies to energy storage as well. I think the report that you spoke about is mostly about solar PV, but the same will apply to storage. And the challenge is this, that as long as there are valuable materials, for instance, the earlier lithium-ion battery technology, which has had nickel and cobalt in it, or nickel and manganese, those would have been easily taken up because there's high value materials coming out of it. The moment you go to a lithium iron phosphate tech, you may see that it's not as exciting for me to sort of strip apart, because I'm not getting the nickel anymore, I'm not getting the cobalt anymore, which is very, very high value. What will that mean then for their incentive to recycle? Again, goes back to the fact that unless it's regulation led, that says that you need to recycle it, so that we're not imposing other costs in the environment and in areas where the mining actually happens, we will not see the kind of uptake. And I think there are enough studies that say that the costs of building these systems going forward will always be lower if you have recycled material going in. And that's where we need to see, going back to the R&D question,
Mhm.
are we doing the R&D for some of this stuff? Because nobody's done this at scale, or not so far.
Yeah.
So India has an opportunity for us to become, and these techniques are well known. It's just that you need to apply it in the context of these new materials that we have not handled as much. Yeah.
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 Perfect. And thanks for painting a bigger picture of what reality looks like. I think it's all about choosing your battles, right? You have to pick wisely. Uh, Karthik and Ashwin, feel free to weigh in. When we talk about the waste that's generated, and I want to elaborate on it a little more, what do you all think could be done by, let's say, at a center level or even at the level of vendors and manufacturers, because limitations will start small and then kind of ripple into a bigger effect. What do you all think can be done at the vendor and manufacturer level to limit the waste while working with these storage systems?
When the scale is low, and get it into the mindset that you are responsible after 25 years. So there are regulatory frameworks for extended manufacturer
Producer responsibility.
producer responsibilities,
Yeah.
that you are responsible for that panel even after 25 years. But the compliance mechanism, the mechanism to actually implement that is where we really need to push down and make sure that happens in practice. Because unless the sector, you can't call the sector green and renewable only because you're manufacturing energy which is not polluting the environment, but then the product itself could do some harm. So it's in the sector's interest for their sustainable growth that they build in that kind of recycling and responsibility right from the get go. Because there are also cases where really, if you haven't thought this through, really old wind turbines at certain sites where their life is over, and there was no one responsible for decommissioning the turbine, so it's just standing there not doing anything. So unless, I take his point that unless it is factored in, built in right from the get go and implemented in spirit, that will be good for the sector's own growth.
I think that's an interesting take. Early intervention integrated into the social fabric. I love it. Coming to my last question, and Ashwin, I want to start with you. What, according to you, is does the future look like for India in terms of these energy storage systems, in terms of scaling it up? Anything that you want to add? Does the future look bright?
The future looks really exciting. Lots of opportunities, few challenges, but I think opportunities is a better lens to look at it. Opportunities from the lens of really manufacturing in India a new emerging technology, which we will have the ability to export to the rest of the world as well. Uh, Finally, giving us a chance to have a sustainable and a clean energy system which is low cost. So it is not just from the climate imperative or the socio-environmental imperative that these systems need to be pushed. That was the sort of dominant narrative a decade or 2 decades ago, that this is needed for the environment. Right now, purely from an economic and a financial standpoint, the certainty of the price, the fixed nature, inflation proof price of these systems, the very low gestation period, and they happen to be environmentally and climate friendly. So it is in our own self, national interest that we quickly scale up clean energy systems which are renewable energy led from the generation side, but storage is an integral part. We need that at scale to support the renewable energy generation side. Only then will this energy transition happen in a manner where you can meet growing demand in the country, meet it reliably, and meet it in an affordable manner. So, really exciting times.
Right.
Yeah,
Karthik, any last thoughts to kind
yeah. I
of
mean,
tie in together the
I think
narrative?
I concur on the positive sentiment with regard to what potential it holds and why we will probably end up going down that path. But it's not going to be something that will happen naturally. Despite the fact that we all guide towards low cost everything, there are vested interests, there are financial barriers to make this transition. I mean, it's funny, right, that something that's cheap actually is seen to be more expensive
Yeah.
in the short run. Right, you go up a barrier, and then after that, it's all downhill from there. But then climbing it is difficult. And I would say, going back to the discussion that we had earlier about distribution companies, about 10 years ago or 12 years ago when I started in this, Ashwin's been there for a little longer, it was all about financial health of distribution companies. That was the only piece of work, because if we fix that, we thought a lot of things could fix. The challenge is we still haven't done that. So, and the reason why that is this is because we've not changed our relationship as a society and as a polity with energy and electricity. I think we need to redefine the way we engage with energy system in what we see as, for instance, the potential to affect, the political economy of, for instance, our of our entire energy system, and that means that you can't be seeing it as a tool for whether it's for vote gain, whether it is for catering to narrow interests. We have to see this as our sort of catapult for getting our economy to the next level. We're talking about what is it now, 5 trillion economy, right? That's the next target. We just became the, I think, the fourth largest economy recently, right? We overtook Germany. So, or was it Japan?
Japan.
We
It is
overtook
Japan.
we
Japan.
overtook Japan. I think Germany is the next in line. We may overtake Germany like fairly easily, but after that, for us to really make that next leap to beat the US and then China, we have to establish something which is truly something would be manufactured in a large way in India. And energy technologies are, of course, part of that, which means that unless we see that we our relationship with energy is really what has kept us at this level, our dependence on the imported tech, imported fuels, which has kept us hooked to consuming the current forms of energy, it's very difficult for us to reimagine that. And how we reimagine that starts with making a public case for why some initial pains, whether it's through prices that reflect that initial cost, whether it is getting our financial entities to sort of pump money into the right sources of electricity or new sources of energy, that's what will probably, I think, help us make this jump. And then where it's like going down the slide, right? It's
Yeah.
the way kids play, I guess, in a playground. You go up and then you come down. It's all nice and easy then. So let's hope we manage to do that. I mean, I know that's a tone of caution, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we will make this
Yeah.
transition.
Yeah, just to build on that, I didn't mean to suggest it's easy,
Yeah,
and
of
I
course.
don't think he was
Yeah,
suggesting that I was saying that. But just to build on that aspect of how would there are challenges. So the whole distribution finances, but why looked at the
yeah,
opportunities lenses. If you look at the a couple of decades from now, if you look at electrification of all transport, if you look at a bulk of electrification of industry, of cooking, the electricity sector is going to significantly grow, and that is going to be the dominant energy supply. And that is where distribution companies have a, an opportunity, because they can really grow big, but they also need to reinvent themselves. They cannot be the electricity distribution companies of the old, where they are giving all the services. Because just as renewable energy and storage prices come down, me as a residential consumer or as a company, I can directly access solar and storage at a price which is cheaper than the cost at which the distribution company is giving me electricity. So now the distribution companies, people can start moving away from the distribution companies. Like, I can put rooftop solar and not have to buy that much electricity. So that has direct pressures on how tariffs are designed, on how costs are recovered and spread across society, across consumers, which part of the cost structure is borne by the government in terms of subsidies, which is borne by the consumers per se. So there's a lot of paradigm shift about to happen, and in that there lies opportunities. There will be winners and losers. Uh, we need to think this through carefully, but I still, I would end on that note, cautiously optimistic.
Redefine and reinvent were the words you all used respectively, and I'm so glad you all did, because this ties in very well with the message we want to drive home through this podcast, which is reimagine energy. Thank you, Karthik and Ashwin, for your time and valuable insights.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
It's clear that India stands at a critical juncture in its journey towards energy sufficiency, but it's also brimming with opportunities. The road to a sustainable renewable power future is complex, but with continued innovation, astute policies, and collaborative efforts, it's well within our reach. The question remains, can we build requisite energy storage systems that will drive us towards a future powered by renewable energy? You see, it's not just about capacity and technology, but about how we can come together as Indians to build a cleaner, greener energy system that benefits us today and for generations to come. To our listeners, if any of you have a take on the subject or any innovative ideas about developing India's energy storage systems, please don't hesitate to post your thoughts and ideas in the comment section. Your feedback is appreciated. After all, our choices today shape the energy landscape of tomorrow. This is Christelle signing out from the Better India.